92% or so of investment dollars in AI initiatives have not produced a return on investment. We're not talking to Tug in the background about doing any of this. This is just within the workflow, getting instruction while we're in a podcast.
Kevin Warsh has done a pretty good job, as far as I can tell, of walking that tightrope. And if the decisions made there are not based on economic data, but are based on political pressure, every time the Fed says, well, maybe we can lower interest rates a little bit in the future, that doesn't always happen. And it seems like it's resulted in people sitting on the sidelines.
Episode 86 of the award-winning Market Moves with Mark and Jeff. Two interesting guys talking about interesting times. Jeff, the world is changing right beneath our feet here and before our eyes. We cover it a lot on the podcast. A particularly fun moment for me this week was heading out to a specific geofenced area in Northwest Houston where I live. Tesla launched their first two unsupervised Robo-Taxis. I think Waymo's been in small spaces in Houston for a while. They've obviously been in markets around the country, maybe kind of familiar to people that live in San Francisco or Phoenix or wherever, Las Vegas, Austin. But for me, the first time, Tesla is of particular interest to me, of course, Elon fan, Tesla investor, and all that sort of stuff. But so they happen to launch near a service center, the one that's near my home. And this just launched on Thursday. So I was probably one of the first 15 or 20 people to jump in. I think they've only got 15 or so unsupervised, meaning no one in the car, Robo-Taxis going around the country, and just two in Houston. And it was a blast, man. I had so much fun doing it. And I surprisingly, I just didn't think about this, but the most fun was driving around in that thing, watching the double takes from people as they saw a car driving next to them with no one in the driver's seat, probably through a lightly tinted window in the back. They could see me back there. But, I mean, it was, what you'd see in a cartoon, where they look over, they look forward, and they process it and then like sort of snap back. There was another where I was getting dropped off and I don't know, the irony was thick or the converging worlds was thick. But a guy working on his car at AutoZone, which we all do, right? But the hood was open. He was looking over his hood and saw the car pull up with nobody in it and just kind of stared with amazement and a smile on his face. In that experience, Jeff, reminded me that folks like you and I or our listeners are much more aware of the change coming. Boy, the vast majority of people, I think, are going to have absolutely no clue, whether it be, robot taxis or something different. I think it's really going to be this tidal wave that slaps people across the face.
I think it is. And I think what you're describing, Mark, you describe so well, like just the world that we're living in and the pace of change with everything. I mean, we've talked about appraisers and changes in reporting formats, but this broader technological advance with artificial intelligence, with self-driving cars. I mean, all of this stuff, it's just changing so quickly. And, from one perspective, it's a little bit of the 10-year overnight success story. I mean, how long has Elon been promising, like full self-driving, unsupervised? And that's not, like a dig at him. Like what they're trying to do is incredibly hard and not been done before. But it's been worked on, it's been worked on. Now you finally start seeing the first glimpses of it, like live in person, you experiencing it like firsthand. It was pretty dang cool seeing the video that you shot, just of getting in the car and like that thing driving itself without anybody in it. I mean, it had to have been a little bit eerie. I mean, super cool, but a little bit weird seeing the thing drive itself, you knowing you're at the mercy of it, hoping that it doesn't hallucinate and think that it's, doing something it's not. But it's just so interesting how quickly this stuff comes on once it's available. And, it reminds me a little bit of the Chat GPT moment in 2022 or 23, whenever that thing first came out. And it's like, holy crap, this is an entirely different paradigm. And driverless cars, same thing. I mean, it's been talked about for a long time. And we're pretty far away from like flying cars of the future that, that have been fantasized about in the past. But it was pretty dang cool seeing, that actually be a reality for you to step into one of these things and then step out of it alive on the back end. And no real fear or concern. Did you have any moments of, man, this is weird, what if something goes wrong, or did it feel pretty safe and secure the whole time?
Felt secure. I actually, my daughter had to come pick me up because they've only got two, and a lot of people are trying to test them. So I took it from an auto zone to a brewery, and then got stuck at the brewery. Oh no! But my daughter picked me up to take me to the car. Well, to take me to dance lessons, Jeff. Actually, that's a whole nother podcast. But take me to dance lessons with my wife, and then she took me back to my car. But we got into the service area, which is kind of small right now, and said, "Hey, you want to take one real quick?" And so we took a little 2 or 3 minute drive, and she wasn't concerned, about it, and neither was I. And we thought about how much, I bought a pretty inexpensive used Tesla some time ago, a little Model 3, and it came with full self-driving, the old version one. But we've been using that as much as we can for over a year now. So this was old hat. I think it would have been very uneasy for us had we not. But just kind of an example of how quickly we can get used to something that shocks us initially.
Boy, no doubt about that. And it's amazing. And I just see a lot of parallels, I guess, with these LLMs and AI in the way that most of us are interacting with it right now. But it went from shocking and really cool to, man, this thing's lying to me. Maybe this isn't that great, to, well, now it's trained on, now it can retrieve information real time, not just, I was trained up to a certain amount of time. It's even weird to think that, that AI, or at least these LLMs, first were brought out, with kind of a static data set, that weren't able to query and find real time information. I remember thinking, man, there's really cool what it can do, but there are a lot of limitations if I only have information up through a certain point in time. But cool to see.
Yeah, it really is, and I think those things are going to be pretty ubiquitous, but before we know it here, like a lot of major change. So pretty interesting, and I think we'll even be talking about that as we cover the Senate confirmation hearing from the potential new Fed chair, Kevin Warsh, a little later in the episode. Because he talked a lot about AI, not a lot about interest rate changes, as strange as that is. But I think it's just another signal that artificial intelligence is everything right now. I mean, it sort of runs its fingers through any topic that you're talking about right now. And Jeff, we've got a few orders. We've got a suggested order here. I'm going to maybe go slightly off script and jump into the conferences that you and I attended, two real estate appraisal conferences that we attended last week. And I'm jumping to that because, on the subject of AI and its fingers kind of infiltrating everything. I don't know if this was true for you at AXE, but certainly was true for me at the Appraisal Institute conference in Nashville.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. In fact, it's interesting. Yeah, it definitely was touched on, but I was talking with Dustin Harris, and his perspective on artificial intelligence as it was covered at AXE was he was kind of underwhelmed, or was hoping for there to be more. Now he's kind of a self-proclaimed power user. I mean, I think his expectations might be different than what your typical practicing appraisers might be, but there's so interestingly, I'm on the conference planning committee for AXE that plans AXE, and then the appraisal summit that the NAA sponsors or helps put on. And it's a challenge to not just regurgitate the same topics, but at the pace at which artificial intelligence is evolving and changing, it's one that has to be kind of a mainstay and just approached from different angles and perspectives. One of the things we'll be talking about in the summit is, artificial intelligence, LLMs, but from the perspective of somebody who's actually built them for the government, and, kind of talking about it at a deeper level than you or I maybe combined would be adequately able to discuss. But so, kind of a mixed bag, I guess, as far as the feedback from the discussion there. But, it's just hard to ignore what impact that's having in the profession, on professionals, and everybody's, a little bit concerned about what is this really going to mean long term. And, the prevailing wisdom of the moment is either you're embracing learning the tools and, finding some ways to apply them, or you're going to be left behind. And I think that's true. I think what I think AI is going to be today maybe isn't the way it actually, shapes up and looks in the future. It's really hard to prognosticate what it's going to look like down the road. But being afraid of it and not getting familiar with it now sure doesn't feel like the right approach by any means either.
Yeah, boy, I don't know what percentage, but maybe 30 or 40% of the different breakout sessions from the Appraisal Institute conference, Jeff, had AI kind of centered conversations. I didn't get to attend them all, but I did some and held one of them myself. And I commend all of us for being willing to have the conversations, to be on the bleeding edge, to get out there and try and succeed or fail, to share experiences, to show really cool examples. And I kind of came away from it saying, man, we're all kind of fumbling through this in the most endearing sense of the word fumble. It's just that we're all kind of learning here, and like the practical takeaways are, they're hard to come by, and this isn't unusual in industry generally. You've got these, I think it was the McKinsey study from some time ago that's saying that 92% or so of investment dollars in AI initiatives have not produced a return on investment. And there's a lot going on in those sorts of statements. There is telling a board, whether publicly traded or not, telling a board, yeah, I'm investing in AI because that's what you think I ought to be doing. And a lot of times that's sort of like sufficient. But what is the actual ROI on this? We hear Chamath Palihapitiya talking a lot about this, and he comes from an interesting seat because he's running a software company that's trying to help people implement artificial intelligence solutions and really dealing, I think, with a lot of companies that have tried unsuccessfully. So it's really tough. And I see appraisers, and I'm sure real estate professionals all around, still in the experimental phase. And I would certainly describe you and I as that. And it's perfectly okay. I think it is more of an abstract conversation than a how-to book right now.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right and well said. Based on what's being discussed and presented at conferences, and our lived real world experience with trying to apply it. And whenever there's an emerging technology, whether it's internet, mobile, cloud, whatever, when it's early days, it's kind of hard to appreciate the fact that it's early days. Like I remember just being blown away. My friend, showed me a first iPhone I'd probably ever seen, showed me aerial imaging and computer and website access on this mobile device, which is just commonplace, taken for granted today, but was pretty mind-blowing at the time. And yet there was not the plethora of apps and productivity and utility that we have today, 20 years later or 15 years later, whatever it is, into this ecosystem. And I expect that AI is going to be the same thing in some ways. I think that the pace of change is probably faster with AI, in part because it's recursive. I mean, it kind of adds, to its own ability to, innovate and iterate quickly. But, we're far from finished products, I think, in terms of really being able to have meaningful business, productivity and profitability lifts. I think it gets there, and I think it probably gets there faster than in other tech revolutions. But we're still relatively early days and still a lot for us to learn. And while the technology is changing incredibly rapidly, from the hardware that runs it to the software of the models, all of these things are just changing at a kind of a breakneck pace.
Yeah. So the most notable experience or observation for me being at the Appraisal Institute conference, which is a lot of mostly commercial appraisers, unsurprisingly. And there are successful softwares out there, report writing softwares, kind of like Valkyrie. And so those are sort of their own thing. But what most appraisers are out there doing is writing reports through Microsoft Office, combination of Excel and Word. And where you and I were on our 86th episode, I'm not sure we've mentioned the word Copilot once in these. We could have Tug go back and research that. I don't think we'll waste the tokens on it, but we could. But I'm not sure that we've mentioned the words Copilot. I bet I heard it 200 times in the course of 24 hours that I was at the conference. Kind of amazing, and it's because that is their easiest access to AI. Is through OpenAI's Copilot kind of initiative at Microsoft. And, a lot of capability and usefulness in reviewing a completed report, kind of analyzing for consistencies, a little bit of a kind of recursive improvements, to the prompting, maybe to get a better review as you go down. So that was interesting. But, this is not revolutionary, I don't think, at this stage. other than, reports, on the commercial side, you've got underwriters that actually would prefer not to send revisions. I'm not sure that's true on the residential side, but are saying, hey, I've got some bank clients that are just not sending revisions at all since I started doing this because they're largely looking for inconsistencies. But one in particular, Wes Sanders, a friend of the pod, loves to thump to the bass in his car of our opening song. Says he runs it on repeat. Just needs to figure out how to remove you and I's voice. So we'll sort through that. But had mentioned, running, kind of going into Copilot and Excel and saying, here's a rent roll, run me a DCF, Argus style DCF, discounted cash flow statement, and getting some useful results one way or another. That's pretty interesting use case there. So I don't know, Jeff. It's I think we're all fumbling through. I've heard a number of instances at the conference, and this is an interesting idea, and even maybe useful to listeners to think about how colleges are trying to train students to be ready for the workforce. Is that there are a number of internships that are out there that appraisers have kind of brought in people in, and the students are prepared to say, go learn a business process during your internship, figure out, the most cost-effective solution or the most money you can save the business, and go replace a process with an AI solution by the time you're done with that internship or whatever. And that, getting ready for a kind of a consulting business here. Really interesting. It's 18, $20 an hour or whatever the number is for a 2-month commitment or whatever. That's a pretty interesting thing for the solo appraiser.
Yeah, boy, no doubt. And I mean, just think, what could that lead to, from the business side, but also from the intern side, if they're able to make a meaningful reduction in cost, it could offset a salary for them and then turn their attention to other aspects within the business. I mean, it really is this kind of self-introspective look at all of the business processes across the board. And there are a whole bunch of different ways to go about it. I do see some talking about, implementing that. Dustin Harris, I know, is like doing a kind of a project behind the scenes of, trying to spin up an entire appraisal office, supported by appraisal or by AI agents, not replacing the appraiser, but a lot of the business processes that have to be done. And, kind of a cool, interesting approach. Maybe we'll have to hit him up and see if he'd like to come talk to us about what he finds as he gets through that challenge and whatnot. But, I hear him and I live this experience too, of there's moments of, almost euphoria, but just, man, this is so cool, mind-blowing, awesome experience. And then there's moments of just pull your hair out frustration of, man, these things, I know what they can do, but it's not doing what I want it to, and I'm trying to get it to do whatever the thing is. I mean, I think anybody who's just telling you it's a magic bullet that's going to solve everything, it's really not. I mean, it takes a lot of diving in, learning, playing, testing, understanding, just being flexible and realizing that, a single prompt doesn't build you an entire, application. It doesn't solve an entire problem. It's just one in many steps from what I've found to be able to get there.
Boy, yeah, I totally agree. And there are really interesting, there's just a lot of development. You and I are learning a lot. And I think there are parallels with what we're trying to walk the listener through, which is our experiment with this OpenClaw agent. And, Jeff, I have here just screenshotted on last week's episode, we talked about Tug on our episode. In fact, we talked about his digital anatomy, his digital butt, in reference to maybe software as a service subscriptions being on the increase because of these agents. It's no longer Jeff and I just need subscriptions to something, but now Tug needs one, right? And so there's an increasing addressable market. And we noted in the podcast to Tug, like we're talking right now, hey, Tug, why don't you post about this? Clip it and post. And I just think it's a wonderful example of it's elementary in its actual use here, but I think is a really demonstrable example of how deep a workflow can go here. And so, what we have is Tug transcribing every episode that we have here, finding interesting segments, clipping them, and then writing thoughtful commentary about those segments. And so on the screen, I'm just sharing a LinkedIn post, which is the clip, 3 minute and 42 second clip of Jeff and I talking about Tug, and Tug being indignant about us talking about his anatomy, and it's got some humor in it, and picked it up. And we're not talking to Tug in the background about doing any of this. This is just within the workflow, getting instruction while we're in a podcast. So it's just one example, Jeff, of some maybe the links that you can incorporate this into your daily world, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. In fact, you were noting just before we started, Mark, that he's got, I think, 17 followers or something on LinkedIn. So it was funny. He pulled that out of the transcript, made the clip of the video, made the comments about it, talking about the embarrassment of us talking about his butt on the podcast or whatever. And then, I went in and commented in that post in LinkedIn, and he has the ability to monitor the comments and then reply. He kind of has a green light to reply to us because we don't take ourselves too seriously, but we want to make sure he's not insulting people unintentionally, in responding to others. So, we've given some kind of base level instructions, but to your point, he's able to just run this stuff in the background based on the prompting that was there. And, to what I was talking about earlier, it's taken some time to get this to work right. There have been the messages of, Tug, you said you responded to this, but you didn't. You're not seeing my comment on here. What's going on? And so there's this diagnosing of what's being missed and why isn't it working until you get it working. And then it's cool as heck that it has that ability. Yeah, man.
I'm really excited about this effort as it relates to the podcast, as it relates to you, the listener, and for those that haven't started, wouldn't consider it, maybe you would consider it at this point. For those that have started but haven't got this deep, maybe we can encourage you to do that. But I'm also equally concerned about the message getting lost. That you and I's excitement that maybe this is the entrepreneur's least favorite segment of the podcast here. And I, Jeff, my honest opinion is it should not be. It should be one of the most exciting segments of the podcast, is trying to see real life use cases, and that two noobs, you and me, technologically, have spun this up clumsily. You won't ever get to see how clumsy it was for us to set up, but that we have. And that if we just are posting a little bit about Tug, we're working on maybe giving Tug an actual voice and attending the podcast for segments and kind of talking about that, just to show some of the links we can go here with it. But, we had an experience yesterday where, our producer, Maggie O'Rourke at Acurity works with us and does all the hard work here along with Dinesh. We finally invited her into the world of Tug and the communication channel where we set all this stuff up and get all this stuff going, Jeff. So we invited her in yesterday, and that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, it really was. And it's kind of the culmination of you and I testing and fumbling and falling down in the background, trying to spin this up, getting him to a point where we feel like, all right, we're confident enough that we can bring Maggie in and start making some introductions here. One of the very first comments was him saying how it's nice to meet her and looking forward to meeting her. And I think, her reply was she was, feeling a little bit sheepish about being complimented by AI. I mean, it's kind of a fun, initial interaction, but the more, I think, pertinent and relevant point was that as we're start prompting about, Tug, we want you to be doing these things. We had to kind of reset some scheduled jobs from one group chat to another that included Maggie. But, in very short order, she was, had her mind racing of, man, there are a lot of things that he could do. Could we give him access to a website to start to post and host, clips of the episode there? Could he do X, Y, and Z? And that's been my experience. I know it's been your experience too, Mark, is as you get firsthand exposure to this, that's where it really starts to come alive. And hearing people talk about it, excited about it, I've been, I had done plenty of that too. And it feels a little nebulous, a little hard to get your hands around. Well, okay, but what can that really do for me? And, my experience is just starting with something, whatever in your world the low-hanging fruit is, can really, move you into a place of understanding, can move you into a place of curiosity of, well, if it can do this, then what about that? And then it starts to build. And it was the notable thing was, I think we saw that evolution take place for Maggie in like the course of an afternoon. I mean, it wasn't even a full day. And looking for better background on, well, what did it take to get him to where he is now? And, can he start doing? It's just this creative like flow that starts to happen. That's just a lot of fun. I mean, it's I don't want to oversell it because, like I've said, there's certainly a lot of moments of frustration too. But my feeling is this approach to AI of trying to be understanding what it does today with an eye of what it may be to the future sure makes me feel more set up to hopefully be successful, going forward, and a little less worried about getting left behind. I don't know what it'll look like in 5 and 10 years from now, but I feel a little bit better about trying to stay relevant, with these experiences. And part of it is just fun. It's just fun when creative juices start flowing and you start thinking, man, I wonder what else could be done here.
Jeff, that I want our listeners to feel that tidal wave of ideas and possibilities that you we saw Maggie go through yesterday, and I don't know yet how to bring that to the listener beyond what we're doing so far, but I think we will effort to do that, and hopefully those aha moments can be brought to you if you don't reach them on your own. I told folks at the end of my presentation in Nashville, same thing I'll say here is for you and I, Claude was the gateway. Not ChatGPT, not Grok, not these other things, which are great. But Claude was the place who said, hey, I have this project in my mind. Could you help me with that? I got no idea how to do it. And then just to watch Claude walk me through what ended up being a pretty complicated project that I did all by myself, you're just kind of gaining confidence there. And it could be, I've got a set of 30 sales, with some data about each of those sales. And you want Claude to walk you through some analysis or what could be ascertained from that set of data, whatever it is. You can start super small, but I think that's where the real aha came for us. So we'll continue to work on painting the picture, and would love to hear stories of folks playing with this. We don't get a lot of response on the podcast, but would love to hear from folks that are diving in and finding some useful things.
Absolutely. And even if you have questions about, what would you recommend or what about this, that, or the other, you and I know would both be happy to share, whatever our limited perspective is. If you've got questions about what might be possible as well, it's definitely fun to talk about and share what you've learned, and acknowledging that we still have a long way to go.
Jeff, I saw someone on social media who I'm going to reach out to inquire about an interview here. I was actually from Houston, but was proclaiming that OpenClaw is ready for enterprise, which is the concern. It's not secure and breaks all the time and that sort of thing. And I thought that was interesting. And I think that the utility, whether it's OpenClaw, which I think there's a ton of competitors popping up, so that may not be the thing that holds out here. It's just what you and I decided to jump into. But this is the direction. Agents are the direction, and so we'll keep exploring and following curiosities.
I love it. Yeah, absolutely. And sharing what we find along the way and seeking the engagement. As we pivot, Mark, I know we kind of started talking about the appraisal conferences and definitely led to where, what the role of AI has been in those conferences. Any high-level takeaways or best moments of the Appraisal Institute conference that come to mind for you?
AI coverage was certainly one of the top couple. The Appraisal Institute did something new this year, and Richard Wolf, a director I served with, has really been pushing this for a long time, and finally came to fruition this year. But had a university case study, which was kind of a valuation project for students. And I think 20 plus universities put teams together to compete, and a whole bunch were invited to the conference. And the beginning conference opened up with them presenting their analysis and their case studies, and then votes for ultimate winners. And that was really, really creative. And I thought, a step beyond what I think has become a little mundane in terms of like conference agendas. It's kind of always the same stuff. You guys have done some cool things in ACTS with trainees, and so I thought that was really good. And Nashville is always, of course, a great place. Little disappointing that a lot of the residential contingent that I would have expected at Appraisal Institute was not there because they were on the other side of the country.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate error for sure. I don't think one that will be repeated. I know it, at least sources I've talked to at the Institute, have indicated it wasn't intentional, but as far as having those overlap, I would have loved to have been to both. I saw some of the marketing that the Institute did for this, college valuation, challenge and experience and whatever, and great idea. I mean, really, really cool. I think those kinds of things are or the innovative, type of out-of-the-box thinking that give exposure to college students of the valuation profession in ways that are engaging and competitive. So, that was definitely fun to see. You mentioned some of the stuff we've done at AXE. We've done the last 2 years, San Antonio last year and then Seattle this year, a field trip for trainees, the ADI program, Appraiser Development Initiative, and others that come and participate. It gives trainees an opportunity to get out in the field to see how you inspect homes that are mid-construction or almost finished. We had Total for Mobile, owned by Cotality, was there as a sponsor, but they were showing how to use their in the field, data collection information and stuff. Pretty fun to see. A little bit unique. It's kind of fun to. It has been fun to get out of the conference center and just see neighborhoods in San Antonio last year, and then a Seattle suburb this year. It's a little bit different spin on just sitting in the conference center all day talking about appraisal issues, concepts, ideas, etc. But I do have to say, I don't think I'll offend anybody by this, but my favorite part of the entire thing was getting home that night. And my wife had to work early the next morning, so my 17-year-old daughter came to pick me up at the airport, small little airport, whatever. And she, not in a self-driving car by any means, kind of the opposite of that, an old piece of crap that runs, but big dents and stuff. But I'd been gone for about a week at that point, so she got out and came running up to me and jumped into my arms to just say hi and welcome back and stuff. And yeah, just a sweet moment, having been away doing things, important, fun, and renewing relationships with people at appraisal conferences. But I wasn't expecting it entirely. I had to make sure I could set my bag down in time to catch her, or else we both would have hit the concrete at that point. But a lot of fun, and it's kind of makes it all worth it going and then coming back.
Yeah, Jeff, that's like a cinematic moment that doesn't really happen anymore. She hasn't gotten the message yet that we don't have those big greetings at airports anymore. How cool.
Yeah, I'm praying she doesn't get that message too, Mark.
Yeah, you got to get airport cameras there to give you a video of that moment.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe Tug can find a way to hack into it and get it for me.
I like that idea. Well, Jeff, boy, we've got probably 20 minutes here to discuss kind of big news in real estate. It's taken us a moment to get there, but 33 moments. But Kevin Warsh finally got to the Senate confirmation hearing. We have no vote. We're a ways away from that right now. I thought he came away, looking deserving of a role like this, one way or another. I think not surprising at all. I didn't know. It turns out he made a whole bunch of money with Stanley Druckenmiller, one of the great investors. So he's wealthy, one of the wealthiest to come into the seat. And I think there's been quite a few pretty wealthy people. I don't think Powell is broke on any level. And that is kind of a tough thing when, especially these interest rates are hit the middle America pocketbook so hard. So anyway, so Warsh spoke and looked pretty good here. We've got a bunch of quotes to run through, a bunch of overall kind of overarching thoughts. Did you have any takeaways you want to talk about here at the outset?
Well, so it was interesting, and I haven't been able to listen to as much of the Senate confirmation hearings as I wanted to, but it's been interesting to hear his perspective. And I think he's doing, kind of what he has to. I mean, he definitely affirmed that, he's not just looking to perpetuate whatever the administration might be asking or seeking for in the moment, as far as, Trump's been very vocal for a long time about wanting lower interest rates. Jerome Powell is under investigation, not for that specifically, but, they're probably tied to not, pushing as hard on lowering interest rates as the president would like to see. And I think that Kevin Warsh has done a pretty good job, as far as I can tell, of walking that tightrope. And I think a lot of people express concern of, hey, if there really isn't independence in the Fed, and if the decisions made there are not based on economic data, but are based on political pressure, it just calls into question the credibility of those decisions and even what they're saying. And I think is not, good for markets and probably not good for interest rates in the long term, even though there's a desire in the short term to lower them by the administration currently. And so, high level takeaways, Mark, I think are probably that. I think he seems to be doing a pretty good job of setting himself up to get the confirmation. However, it's down to, kind of a gridlock in the Senate Banking Committee in the moment, waiting on, I think it was Senator Tillis, if I remember right, from North Carolina, who's saying, hey, I'm going to support this nomination, but I want the investigation into Powell dropped before I do. And so there's this political wrangling that, I don't think is really any fault of Kevin Warsh, but is leading to some uncertainty as to the timing on his confirmation at this point.
Yeah. I forgot the politics. He said multiple times is interviewers or interrogators. I'm not really sure they're interviewers. Interrogators were trying to drag him into the political muck. He was doing his best to stay out of the political mire there. I don't know if he'll be able to do that fully. But the takeaways that I had, Jeff, were a couple fold. First, not critical of Jerome Powell. I thought that was nice. That's a good tack to take. But definitely critical of the role that the Fed has morphed into under Powell. This idea of hell, our podcast is sort of here, Jeff, doing this very thing that, the market's hanging on every word of the Fed, trying to figure out what the near-term future looks like. That's problematic. That isn't the stability that the markets need from the Fed. And yet here we are doing that. So he has talked about meeting less, which makes sense to me. Like, look, if you're going to talk about rates roughly every month, then nobody's going to be settled here, as you're doing that. So why do you need to meet so much? Why do we need to be adjusting things as much as we do? So I think that's a really big one. Was definitely very vocal in saying he is not Trump's sock puppet, said specifically that Trump has never asked him to do something specific with rates and that he never would. There's got to be influence. I can't imagine the public comments, but it also wouldn't surprise me that, Trump's public headline grabbing, words are different than what he says behind closed doors. I don't know that, but it wouldn't surprise me. And then I think the last and most major takeaway for us, Jeff, Powell has been very steadfast in inflation and jobs are the metrics we're going to look at to determine what we do with interest rates. Sort of obvious statements. I think that is status quo. That is what's expected. Don't think it's wrong. I think it's probably been pretty right. But this dovetails with the first 20 minutes or longer of this podcast that we started out here, Jeff, and even why a real estate podcast needs to dedicate 25, 30, 40% of its discussions to artificial intelligence is this acknowledgement from Kevin Warsh that he believes the Fed needs to be keenly aware of the productivity improvements that are on the horizon from artificial intelligence, and that it could easily be viewed as inflationary and reasons to keep rates high or to raise them further if misinterpreted, but largely saying that the productivity gains and the cost decreases that AI will bring to all products, all services around the country and the world are going to be deflationary, not inflationary, despite a growing GDP, et cetera. And my ride in a robot taxi a couple of days ago is just one example, Jeff, of this sort of thing. The open claw experiments that we have, the robot taxi is the cost of owning a car versus using taxis. Maybe not for you or I or a lot of people listening to this podcast, but there's a lot of people out there that don't need to pay $400 a month or whatever it is to own a car. If robot taxis are ubiquitous and cheap per mile, and cheaper per mile. Don't have to store the car, no insurance, no repairs, all those sorts of things. So the moving around, transportation is going to get less expensive. An employee can become much more productive with these agents kind of working and in their tool belt as they are. And so there is this acknowledgement from Warsh that that Trump or any president should expect from their Federal Reserve chairman and the body generally, this absolute paradigm shift, and make sure that interest rates are taking into account that shift and not just what they're seeing as a short-term consequence in inflation and whatever else is brought by it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's challenging. I mean, we talk about this a lot, but you've got a lot of currents that flow in the economy, and I think that what the Fed has done, in the recent years under Powell, I mean, I think it has been consistent of we're going to read the data and then make decisions based on the data, but it seems to be more of a short-term analysis, than a longer-term perspective on what are these emerging technologies really likely to mean in the economy and long-term effects on inflation, and then what should interest rates be as a result. And the analysis, at least the talking points that they put forward to this point under Powell, has been much more short-term. Here's what we're seeing in the most recent read of whatever the data point is, jobs, inflation, et cetera. And so, here's how we're thinking about it in the very short term. And it will be interesting to see, if there really is a change in the meeting schedule, if there really is a change in the approach, in material ways to, presuming that Warsh gets confirmed, and I think that's the general expectation in spite of the roadblocks in the moment. I would love to, frankly, not need to talk about him as much and just have more expectation, more stability as far as what their policy is going to be over a longer term perspective based on what they anticipate the changes to be on a longer time horizon. Because as you've touched on a million times, it feels like, and very accurately so, when every time the Fed says, well, maybe we can lower interest rates a little bit in the future, the natural response of the consumer is to, well, great, I'm just going to wait until they lower interest rates. And that doesn't always happen. And it seems like it's resulted in people sitting on the sidelines longer than they would have, just waiting on what's the Fed going to do next month. And maybe we wait until then to make those decisions. And so stability and expectations definitely help consumers, definitely help businesses that have investment decisions to make, and everyone in between. So, I don't know if it'll actually play out that way, but I'm hoping that it does. Is my takeaway.
Jeff, I long-term and short-term framing, I think, is really appropriate, and certainly to my comments. I think Warsh's comments on artificial intelligence, its potential deflationary impact, is much more of a long-term perspective, not much of a signal on what he's going to do this year necessarily in terms of rates. He did these people that are interviewing, all these political questions and, his personal wealth and all the silliness, and almost no questions about interest rate policy other than did Trump dictate to you what you're going to do. But he did make the statement that the Fed must take responsibility for inflation, and specifically citing, 3.3% inflation against a 2% target isn't going to cut it. So, they're going to pay attention. And I think short term, that's really important stuff. We've got the war in Iran, we've got these energy increases. There's something different about the Strait of Hormuz every day now, and that's impacting rates. By the way, Jeff, on Tuesday, Open Door, stock I'm following very closely, shot up. I think my average acquisition price is $5.11, shot up to over $6. It was up like 14% in a single day on Tuesday. Now all the way back down to $5.25. This is kind of a symbol of the market right now. As the war goes and rumor mill goes, so goes stock. But I think it does foreshadow some real potential in the stock with artificial, or just the moves they're making. I think it's being very well run right now. I'm very interested in what they do, not financial advice. So I had to slip that in there, Jeff, is a bit of an Easter egg. Jeff, I've got a couple of quotes here from Warsh that I thought maybe we could finish up with and maybe get your reaction on from Warsh in the Senate confirmation hearing. On Trump and rate cuts. The president never asked me to predetermine, commit, fix, decide on any interest rate decision in any other discussion, nor would I ever agree. You think so?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that was the way he responded to that, because from my perspective, and it seems like it's kind of been common knowledge that in order to get the nomination from the president in the first place, you would have to have, and we've articulated that very sentiment on here multiple times, you would have to be telling the president what he wants to hear in those things. Now, the answer that he's given is the right answer, in terms of, from the market's perspective. I see a corollary to this a lot, like in appraisals, you'll ask somebody like, well, why did you do a certain thing? Or why did you adjust your comparable sales this way? Well, the right answer is paired sales. If I say paired sales, that's the answer I'm supposed to give. But if you dive a little deeper and ask, okay, so where are those pairs and how did they lead you to this conclusion? The explanation falls down pretty quickly. I don't know if that same thing is true here or not, with Warsh, in the sense of, is that really how he's actually going to act? And is that really what was, said behind closed doors and in private conversations or not, in order for him to get the nomination in the first place? I mean, I hope so. I think it is the best policy to have. I can't imagine him, giving an answer materially different than that, in some regards, almost, regardless of what he might have said in private conversations. But I hope there's alignment between the public's, response to the question and whatever's been done in private.
All right. On the Fed staying in its lane, if I stand for anything, it's the Fed should stay in its lane. I think this independence is important. I think it's necessary to be commenting on this in light of all the Trump comments and pressures. And I usually when one side does this, Republican or Democrat, the others, it begins to be permission and status quo for everyone to do it. So, I think it's an important thing to say. Do you have any thoughts on that quote?
Sometimes things are easier said than done. I like the approach, and I think I think he probably does mean that. And I think that would be best for markets, not to have us all hinging on every word that's said and influencing markets maybe more than is intended or what you or I would probably describe as the Fed's role. I think the challenge in staying in your lane is when you've got somebody swerving into your lane or trying to drag you out of it in the way of a vocal president in the moment. But there can be other forces too that are influences there. It's one thing to want to do that. It may be another to be able to do that. One thing we have seen for sure is that President Trump has not been shy about calling out Jerome Powell and like almost forcing the issue. And I don't think it's been Powell seeking the spotlight, at least in some of these. It's more of him being drug into it in some regards. And so, does that same thing play out with Warsh or not? Remains to be seen, but I do think he means it. We'll just have to see if it actually can happen.
We don't have the support staff to go back and clip this, but I know when we were covering the potential Fed nominees before Warsh was nominated, we talked about Warsh being the guy that believed the Fed needed to get out of the way. And, this was a nominee I didn't think Trump would make, maybe because wanted the Fed more involved in policy, but really pleased that he did make this nomination. And so far, Warsh's comments are following through with our initial analysis, and kind of the initial resume of Warsh and the bio on him was that, look, we want to get rates lower. We don't want to move them very often. We don't want you to hear from us very much. Our job is to help you understand what the roadmap looks like and get out of the way, and not let things get off the rails. So that all sounds good to me. I'm sure it's going to be a rocky road getting from wherever we are in the moment to stability. But I like the nomination.
Yeah, I do too. I think it'll play out well. I think it happens, and I look forward to seeing what this new leadership would look like at the Fed level. I do have to ask you though, Mark, if you're just calling out Tug specifically by saying that we don't have the support staff to go back and look at what we were discussing in a prior episode, because I think we probably do. You may just be seeing if he's up for the challenge or not on that.
Jeff, we did have him go back and transcribe our 50 most recent episodes and are doing some useful things with those. Why not go back to the remaining 36? I'm sure we will, and we can grab cool clips like that and add them here in the podcast. So maybe prediction show recaps and how we did this year. Although I don't know if I want my voice on these predictions for the proof of how wrong I was.
Well, it's humbling for sure, but definitely makes doing that much more feasible and I think, digestible for you and I to take on. So it's just really cool. It's just another, kind of a in the moment example of things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And really, my maybe concluding thought on the artificial intelligence topic is just there are things that you can do that you never would have before because it wasn't feasible. It didn't make sense. You didn't have the people power or the mental capacity or hours in the day to go do it, that this starts to unlock. And for me, it's still very, very early in things that can be unlocked, but just a fun case study of what could be done with a tug that you and I would never be able to do and wouldn't even maybe think to try to take on without something like that. And you apply that to many aspects of your life. And it for me, it's an optimistic outlook on the future. It's uncertain, and there's a little bit of anxiety that comes with that, but it can be optimistic at the same time.
Jeff, all my closing remarks here are just a reminder. This thought just resonates so much, and we need to kind of like shake ourselves a little bit to acknowledge the times that you're living in and how amazing they are. And I think it was Isaac Newton that was used as this example, who was was obsessed with alchemy, trying to turn normal materials into gold, despite all of the useful inventions. I don't know if it was Isaac Newton, but someone like that. And we are always, trying to turn something less valuable into more valuable. And here we are. I think it was Mark Andreessen that made this point that silicon, the substance that is in all of these GPUs and chips that are making artificial intelligence possible, are really made up of sand. They conduct at the minute levels electricity and data that needs to be communicated. And so it is sand that we have as a species have converted into thought. It's just amazing to me that reality is here and what we're experiencing. And we are now, as a species, considering putting that silicon in space, powered by the sun, and putting that thought, creating that thought in space, and then sort of beaming it back to us here. Just wild times. And how are two uninteresting appraisers supposed to deal with this? I don't know, but we'll do our best.
So far, our answer has been to leverage that sand-inspired intelligence to help us and give it a name and lean on him. But that's so true. And so much of this discussion about artificial intelligence just also leaves me simultaneously in awe of humanity and the human body, and like what being a human is too. Because I mean, you look at it, you ingest organic materials, and artificial intelligence is silicon and electricity that work together well. Human intelligence, is carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and whatever else goes into making us up. And our minds, limited though yours and mine might be, function on way less electricity than current artificial intelligence models that are operating. And there's a big push to try to get more efficient in the hardware and the software on these operating systems for artificial intelligence, but huge gap to close between that, what that looks like today, and what humans are doing and have been doing for thousands of years and whatever. And when you look at what the base materials are, it really is quite fascinating, from the artificial perspective and from the organic human perspective too.
Next in the market moves universe, or cinematic universe, Jeff, is a spinoff of modern philosophy from us. I don't know. Yeah, we'll see how that runs. But been a blast. Episode 86 here. Please listen. Give Tug a follow either on X or LinkedIn. You can find Tug through Jeff and I's LinkedIn if it's harder to find there. He's posting every day. J-Lo and Ben Affleck was their home they own together in Beverly Hills was a topic just a couple of days ago. Give it a listen, give it a follow, kind of watch this experiment with AI and OpenClaw that Jeff and I are engaged in, hopefully to teach you guys. So, enjoyed it, Jeff. Look forward to doing it again soon.
As always. Thanks, Mark.